Hello, and welcome to episode 16 of Super Deep Movie Analysis. I'm actor and screenwriter Lec Zorn, and it's great to finally be back with my first new episode in 427 days. I've greatly missed making new episodes, and I apologize for my long absence. I've been so consumed with work, film, and other pursuits, I just haven't had the time to sit down and super deep analyze a movie well enough to make an episode. I hope to make up for that by making many new episodes over the next several months on some of my all-time favorite movies, from Hollywood blockbusters to obscure treasures. Well, in my last episode, I'm dressed in auto racing gear as I was super deep analyzing the auto racing drama titled Driven a few hours before last year's Indianapolis 500, and now I'm dressed in football gear for this episode. In addition to being an actor and screenwriter, I'm also a high school sports commentator here in the Indianapolis area. I'm about to start my 6th season commentating high school football, basketball, baseball, and softball for WYRZ and XRB Radio and Audio Sports Online. This jersey is for the University of Indianapolis, the Greyhounds, an NCAA Division II team that I'm a fan of, and this cap is for Cascade High School, the Cadets, one of the main high schools that I commentate. And as I particularly love commentating football and miss it greatly during the 9-month off-season, I'm celebrating the start of the new season by super deep analyzing my favorite high school football movie, the 1983 drama All the Right Moves, starring Tom Cruise. This movie was released in October of 1983, just 2 months after Risky Business, which made Cruise a major star. All the Right Moves had a solid publicity campaign which attempted to capitalize on Cruise's newfound fame, but the movie was only a moderate hit, grossing $17 million at the American box office according to IMDb, and quickly falling into semi-obscurity, lost in the shadow of many of Cruise's massive hits. I remember seeing the movie advertised on TV several times, but despite my love for football, I didn't get around to seeing the movie for another 28 years. Then back in the summer of 2011, when I was 40 years old, I saw the DVD for $3 at a Big Lots store here in Indianapolis, and then went to IMDb on my phone and read a few of the user reviews to get an idea of whether I'd like the movie or not. I decided that I would, so I bought the DVD, and the movie became an instant favorite of mine. Amid the title song sung by Chris Thompson and Jennifer Warnes, the opening credits of the movie do a great job establishing the setting of Ampipe, Pennsylvania. We see a variety of shots of the lower middle-class neighborhoods, the high school, and the pipe and steel mill where seemingly every man in town has worked over the last 3 generations. Cruise plays Stefen Djordjevic, who goes by the nickname Steph. He's a senior cornerback for the team and lives with his older brother Greg, played by Gary Graham, and their father, played by Charles Cioffi, both of whom work at the mill. It's implied that Steph's and Greg's mother is dead. The 3 Djordjevic men are all physically tough, and the older 2 are somewhat unpolished, but they're a close family who always support and look out for each other. Unlike many of today's high school athletes, Steph has no delusions of grandeur. While he's a pretty good player and student, he knows he probably doesn't have the talent to make the NFL nor the grades to get an academic scholarship. So he's hoping to get a football scholarship, particularly at a good engineering school, to get out of his economically struggling town. Greg and his father apparently have no post-high school education and want Steph to get the chance they never had. Steph has a girlfriend, a junior named Lisa, played by Lea Thompson, who's a saxophonist in the school band. The 2 are in love, and she hopes that he'll play college football close to home, but he's more ready for sex than she is. In an early scene, the 2 are lying down in the front seat of Lisa's car, kissing, when Steph makes a sexual advance. She resists, saying she's not ready yet. Steph mentions the possibility that some of his friends see the car, and she's offended, thinking that Steph wants the sex, at least in part, to impress his friends. She makes clear that if they do have sex, she wants it to be for the right reasons and doesn't want it to be in a car. While a lot of people will probably be uncomfortable with the explicitness of the scene, it shows great insight, presenting the psychology of teenage sex from both a male and female perspective, probably better than in any movie I've ever seen. Also early in the movie, Steph is visited by a recruiter from an apparently mid-level NCAA Division I college. Steph is appreciative, but says he's wanting to look at other schools. Still, the recruiter assures Steph that a scholarship is his for the taking. As soon as the recruiter leaves, Greg and his father both express concern to Steph that he's being too picky, having not received a lot of offers. But Ampipe's next game is at Walnut Heights, who's undefeated, ranked number 3 in the state, and located in a wealthy area. Steph expects that many scouts from major colleges will be at the game, and that if he plays well, his recruiting stock will go up. The week of the game, we get to know Ampipe's head coach, Vern Nickerson, played by Craig T. Nelson. He's a tough, no-nonsense coach and also teaches typing. He's in his 5th year at the school and is seeking college coaching jobs. And in the first 20 minutes of the movie, referring to the town of Ampipe, Steph tells his teammate Brian Riley, played by Christopher Penn, "We're getting out of here," while Nickerson tells his wife Suzie, played by Sandy Faison, "We're going to get out of here," thus establishing one of the movie's major plot elements. The aforementioned Brian Riley, a lineman who's the team's defensive captain, has recently accepted a scholarship offer from the University of Southern California. But during a pregame pep rally, he nervously tells Steph that they need to talk. The two go into the locker room, and Brian confides that his girlfriend Tracy, played by Paige Price, is pregnant. Steph asks Brian how Tracy feels about an abortion, and Brian glumly says not very good. Steph suggests that Brian explain the situation to USC in the hope that they'll keep his offer and help him get a job to support Tracy and the baby, but Brian seems to think that his college career has ended without ever beginning. Late in the Walnut Heights game, Steph intercepts a pass and returns it for a touchdown, giving Ampipe a 14-10 lead. But in the last minute, now under heavy rain, he's called for pass interference as he disregards Nickerson's emphatic orders to play the ball, not the man. The penalty puts Walnut Heights close to the goal line. They turn it over on downs, but on Ampipe's ensuing possession, running back Vinny Salvucci, played by Paul Carafotes, fumbles. Walnut Heights recovers the ball in the end zone for the winning touchdown with no time left. And by the way, the number of timeouts that Walnut Heights had remaining is not revealed, so we don't know if Ampipe could have knelt out the clock or not. In the locker room after the game, Nickerson blasts Salvucci for supposedly quitting on the team. Steph comes to Salvucci's defense, criticizing Nickerson for not ordering the quarterback to keep the ball and accusing Nickerson of quitting on the team. Nickerson is furious and dismisses Steph from the team. When Steph starts to board the team bus to go home, Nickerson tells him to ride on the cheerleader bus. Instead, Steph tries to find an Ampipe fan to ride home with. Lisa sees him walking away from the buses and asks him what's wrong. He says he doesn't want to talk about it and wants to be alone at the moment. She persists, and he shouts at her in front of some of the players and cheerleaders. An Ampipe fan ends up taking Steph part of the way home, then some other fans, including an obnoxious loudmouth named Bosko, played by James A. Baffico, take him the rest of the way. Throughout the journey, Steph drinks an unhealthy amount of alcohol. During that time, Greg and his father are at a bar in Ampipe and have learned of Steph's dismissal. They realize that it could cause Steph to be viewed negatively by recruiters and severely hurt his chances of getting a scholarship. The father goes home saying he's going to urge Steph to apologize and reconcile with Nickerson. But the people who are taking Steph home stop along the way at Nickerson's house and spray paint insulting comments on the front. At first, Steph opens a bag of garbage that's set for the garbage men to pick up and dumps it onto the lawn, but when he sees the others spray painting, he urges them to stop. Nickerson's approximately 5-year-old daughter hears the ruckus and alerts her father, who opens the door and sees the vandals leaving the scene, though it's initially not clear whether he recognizes Steph or not. On Monday, possibly having been told by his father to do so, Steph apologizes to Nickerson for their argument in the locker room and asks for reinstatement to the team, which has one remaining game at home. But Nickerson says he saw that Steph was one of the vandals. Steph starts to explain his side of the story, but Nickerson won't listen and tells Steph that he's played his last game with the team. Steph then tries to patch things up with Lisa, who is very hurt by Steph treating her hostilely in front of others. She also expresses anger that scholarships are available for football players but not for musicians, which she is. The next Friday, Greg is laid off along with 700 others. He decides to vent by going to the bar and getting drunk, and at his request, he's driven by Steph. Later that evening, Lisa comes over telling Steph that she skipped the game because she doesn't like football and had attended the previous games only to watch him. She also tells him that she loves him, and they proceed to have sex for the first time. Over the next few weeks, several Ampipe players receive football scholarships, and Brian marries Tracy with the baby due shortly. Brian seems willing to give up his football career, feeling that being a husband and father is more important. Meanwhile, Steph's college prospects look bleak. His scholarship offers are revoked, leading him to believe that he's been blacklisted by Nickerson. So Steph, with Lisa by his side, goes to Bosko at the bar and asks him to set things straight with Nickerson. Bosko not only refuses, but also makes very abrasive and insensitive comments to Steph and Lisa, leading to a physical fight between the two men. Because of her love for Steph, Lisa overcomes her bitterness over football players having opportunities that musicians don't. She goes to Nickerson's wife, Suzie, in the hope of bringing peace between Steph and Nickerson. And Salvucci, a player who Nickerson has tried to help personally, is arrested for armed robbery, perhaps putting Steph's offenses into a more balanced perspective in Nickerson's mind. And after all the bitterness and conflict, in the end we get a powerful lesson about the importance of forgiveness, communication, and selflessness, and about people being able to achieve their goals much better united than divided. One of the things that makes this movie work so well is that it avoids probably the biggest sports movie cliche, which is the focus on the big game. While there have, of course, been some great movies that follow that formula, it had already been done so many times by 1983 that it was hard to do and make it feel fresh, and that's even more the case now 34 years later. Furthermore, I think many sports movies would be hard to like without being a fan of the sport that the movie is about. But I think this movie could easily appeal to many non-football fans, as it's about life much more than about football. Of course, Steph is a football player and he loves the game, but he's using it as a means to an end, rather than treating it as an end in itself. On the surface, this movie is about football, but at the core, it's about universal themes, such as the desire to improve our conditions, and also about the life lessons that I mentioned just a little earlier. And further elaborating on communication, had certain people communicated open-mindedly earlier in this movie, some of the conflicts wouldn't have ended up being anywhere near as serious. And that's very often the case in real life, and especially in this era in which so many high school and even middle school athletes focus on playing professionally and have loaded egos fueled by having their own YouTube channels of highlights and reading about themselves on recruiting web pages. It's refreshing that Steph's main ambition with football is to get a college education. But while I love all those aspects of the movie, football was the reason I wanted to see it in the first place, and people who watch it out of love for the sport probably won't be disappointed. Though the Walnut Heights game is the only game scene, the people who made the movie are clearly big football fans and did an outstanding job portraying the atmosphere of big-time high school football, both on and off the field, as well as the college recruiting process. Though I did not play high school football, I'm about to start my 6th season of commentating it, as I said earlier, and I attended dozens of high school games prior to that. And a few years ago, one of the major sports web pages, I don't remember which one, rated Indianapolis, where I reside, as the 3rd best high school football area in the country behind Dallas and Los Angeles, I think in that order. So all that to say, I've seen lots of big-time high school football. And in addition, the movie does an excellent job portraying the special relationships that many small towns have with their local high school teams. Probably in large part from lack of other things in the community to get excited about, small-town high school teams are often a major point of local unity, identity, and pride. I do see a lot of enthusiasm when I commentate games here in Indianapolis, but I typically see even more when I commentate games outside of the metropolitan area. In those places, the high school football and basketball games are often the hottest ticket in town, and those are my favorite places to commentate. In Ampipe, we see that the ups and downs of the team are the water cooler conversation around the town. When I was growing up, that's how it often was here in Indiana with the high school basketball teams. But over about the last 15 to 20 years, the emphasis has shifted more to football, largely resulting from Peyton Manning being such a superstar with the Indianapolis Colts, while Indiana University and Purdue University went through down stretches in basketball. And this movie also does a great job portraying how much high schools in economically struggling areas desperately want to beat teams in wealthy areas, as is the case with Ampipe against Walnut Heights. I think it's human nature for people from towns like Ampipe to view people from towns like Walnut Heights as spoiled and privileged. Furthermore, athletics are very emotionally important to many people, and a victory for a community like Ampipe, especially over a wealthy community, often gives residents a jolt that provides temporary relief through tough times. Another thing that helps the movie a lot is that the characters are very realistic. When I look back at a lot of the movies of the 1980s that include a lot of teenage characters, I now realize that they seem to be based more on other teenage movie characters rather than on real people. One of the few exceptions is Fast Times at Ridgemont High, probably because screenwriter Cameron Crowe was just a few years out of high school when he wrote it. Well, I don't know how old screenwriter Michael Caine was when he wrote All the Right Moves, but he did an outstanding job with the characters nevertheless. And regardless of his age, I'd guess that Caine was involved in high school football, as this movie knows its subject matter very well. And by the way, screenwriter Michael Caine is not to be confused with actor Michael Caine. The screenwriter's last name is spelled Kane. And another aspect that adds to the movie's realism is that Nickerson is a typing teacher. When I was in high school, under Indiana High School Athletic Association rules, all of the head coaches had to be teachers at the school, which I think is still the case, and many of them taught subjects such as typing, health, and physical education rather than the heavyweight academic subjects. For example, in ninth grade, my typing teacher, Mr. Brad Tucker, was the boys' basketball junior varsity head coach. Now, surprisingly, the head coach who I've commentated the most, Brian Woodard at Plainfield High School, is actually a biology teacher, but he seems like an exception. And by the way, I once asked him if he's familiar with this movie, and he said yes, and immediately followed it by simply saying the name Stefen Djordjevic, which greatly impressed me. But anyway, Nickerson being a typing teacher is only a minor detail, but like I said back in the Falling from Grace episode, it's often the minor details that give a movie the most realism. And to top it off, the characters are brought out to the fullest by an outstanding cast. Tom Cruise, of course, does a great job as always, but I give the game ball to Craig T. Nelson, who previously played quarterback on his high school football team and went on to star as a college head coach in the TV sitcom simply titled Coach, which ran from 1989 to 97. Nelson is outstanding as a tough and passionate disciplinarian who wants to win in the worst way, while also wanting a better life for himself and his family. One thing that isn't a major point, but that I like very much about the movie, is that it shows a lot of friendly, positive interaction between blacks and whites at the school, both on and off the team. And while I don't drink alcohol, I do like that when Rick says that he's going to get drunk, he at least has Steph drive him, so, apparently Rick is not going to drive drunk that night. And I remember in the early 80s, it seemed that was when the awareness about not driving drunk was starting to become very widespread. And on the subject of race, it's striking from a modern perspective that in the locker room while getting his team fired up for the Walnut Heights game, Nickerson said that Mpipe was given only 500 tickets to the game because they're viewed by Walnut Heights as the Dagos, the Polacks, and the niggers. That exact quote. Now granted, he was merely explaining to the players how they were perceived by others, rather than actually calling the players by those names, but these days any coach who spoke the N-word would probably be fired. But like I often say, it's always important to assess movies in context of when they were made. And on a major trivial note, while Cruise's impact on this movie is obvious, it also caused major impact on another movie. On their audio commentary from the 2004 DVD release of Footloose, producer Craig Zadan and screenwriter-music writer Dean Pitchford said that Cruise auditioned for the role. Let me start over. On the audio commentary for the 2004 DVD release of Footloose, producer Craig Zadan and screenwriter-music writer Dean Pitchford said that Cruise auditioned for the role of lead character Rin McCormick, and that the casting department was interested in him for the role, but that the end of his All the Right Moves shooting schedule overlapped the beginning of what would have been his Footloose shooting schedule by 2 weeks. And while the filmmakers would have waited the 2 weeks, they didn't in this case because of the threat of a writer's strike. Of course, the role ended up going to Kevin Bacon and launching him into major stardom. However, one actor, Christopher Penn, did appear in both movies, and ironically, he plays the main character's best friend in both of them, Willard Hewitt in Footloose, and as I said earlier, Brian Riley here in All the Right Moves. Sadly, Penn died on January 24th, 2006 at the age of 40 after gaining much weight in his later years. According to his autopsy, his death was caused by nonspecific cardiomyopathy. Nonspecific cardiomyopathy. One of the few flaws that this movie has, most of the few flaws that this movie has probably stem from the era of its release, which was near the beginning of a bad trend that I mentioned back in the Rocky IV episode. From about 1983, the year of this movie's release, until about 1992, major Hollywood studios pressured filmmakers to keep their movies down to about 90 minutes to make more money. The thinking was that you pay the same amount for a ticket regardless of the length of a movie, so if a movie is 90 minutes instead of 2 hours, you can get more showings in during a day and obviously make more money. This practice ended when movie theaters started regularly showing the same movie on multiple screens. But while the trend was going on, many movies were hurt by being cut down too much. All the Right Moves was apparently one of those movies. I think 3 plot elements were underdeveloped because of the movie's length of 91 minutes. When Salvucci is arrested, the viewer is surprised as there was never any previous mention of him committing a crime. Also, the conversation between Lisa and Suzie feels like something is missing. And in the last scene, Greg is seen to have gotten his job back, even though the movie made no mention of it. Though it's not likely because of the movie's relative obscurity, I hope an extended cut of the movie is someday released, giving those plot elements and maybe others full development. Still, I like what there is between Lisa and Suzie for several reasons. They communicate very well with each other, which is important not only because communication is good in general, but also because in this case it helps overcome the lack of communication between Steph and Nickerson. In addition, I like intergenerational friendships. I often say that I consider everyone I meet to be both my teacher and my student, because we're all inherently different to begin with, and furthermore, we all have a lot to learn from each other, as we all have so many unique experiences. But I think that's even more so the case with people of different generations, and by communicating and forming friendships with them, we can also reduce the misunderstandings that often exist between generations. And finally, I greatly appreciate a discussion that the two women have about Lisa possibly losing Steph, and about Suzie's past. Suzie warns Lisa that she'll likely lose Steph when he goes away to college, but Lisa says, "I have to let him go. I love him." That exact quote. Very few people are that selfless, but that's an example of love in its purest form, and that's a great example for us to follow. Suzie goes on to say that she was in love with a boy in high school, and they planned to get married, but he joined the Army and she met her husband at North Carolina State. Lisa asks what happened to Suzie's high school boyfriend, and she says she doesn't know. I appreciate the conversation so much for 2 reasons. One is that we see Lisa's selflessness, that she loves Steph so much she's willing to lose him if it'll help him achieve his dream of going to college. And the other is that often when we're at that age, we fall so hard for someone that we can't imagine ever loving someone else. Yet most of the time, not only do those relationships not work out, we often even completely lose touch with those people, though I guess the losing touch part is now less common because of Facebook. Before you see this movie, you should be warned that it is a fairly heavy R, primarily for language, sex, and nudity. This is one of those movies that a lot of people would probably like overall, but wish the content was milder. I always say that for the sake of maximizing the potential audience, I would only make a movie rated R if I absolutely couldn't tell the story adequately with a PG rating. I think the story could have adequately been told with a PG-13 rating, but that rating didn't exist until a year after the movie's release. I even think the story could have been adequately told with a PG, but maybe the filmmakers decided that an R would attract more teenagers than would a PG. I'm not a fan of the movie rating system, as I think it does more harm than good, which is a long discussion for another time. But I think if the movie rating system is going to exist, it's best that there be a rating between PG and R. And in addition to maximizing the potential audience, there's another reason that I think the sex scene should have been toned down. I think filmmakers should consider what messages they want the audience to heed, and how to best achieve that. And part of that is removing things that are a distraction from those messages. Sadly, some people probably walked away from seeing All the Right Moves remembering the sex scene more than anything else. Now, Steph and Lisa having sex is a significant plot element, but it could have been established that they had sex without being so gratuitous and thus distracting the audience from the messages of the movie. In fact, that's one of my very few criticisms of my brother's of my br- in fact that's one of my very few criticisms of my brother Robert McAtee's movie Trail of Crumbs, a mostly outstanding mystery drama with several great messages. There's a sex scene that's much longer and much more explicit than it needs to be, and again, it's a potential distraction. I'd also like to say a few words about the music. As was very common at the time for movies aimed at teenagers, the music in this movie is very pop and rock dominated, apparently in the hope of attracting a large audience with a hit soundtrack, a la Saturday Night Fever, Grease, and just earlier that year, Flashdance. In fact, the filmmakers seemed to be banking so heavily on the music. This is literally the only movie I know of whose closing credits not only start off with the music, but actually even list the scene in which each song was played. However, despite that extraordinary emphasis on the music, the movie's soundtrack had little success, reaching only number 165 on the Billboard chart, while the aforementioned title track by Chris Thompson and Jennifer Warnes reached only number 85. You probably remember Jennifer Warnes primarily for two other duets from movies, both of which hit number 1, Up Where We Belong with Joe Cocker from An Officer and a Gentleman, and I've Had the Time of My Life with former Righteous Brother Bill Medley from Dirty Dancing. She also had a major solo hit in 1977 with Right Time of the Night. The name Chris Thompson is probably unfamiliar to you, but he had a number 1 single in 1976 singing lead for Manfred Mann's Earth Band on Blinded by the Light. I actually met Chris Thompson right after a concert in Louisville, Kentucky in 1995 in which he was a lead vocalist for Alan Parsons. And Chris Thompson is actually a deep source of inspiration for me. In recent years, I've heard a rebroadcast of an American Top 40 episode from April 25th, 1981, in which Casey Kasem reads a long-distance dedication letter from a woman who dedicates Thompson's 1990s. Let me start over again. In recent years, I've heard a rebroadcast of an American Top 40 episode from April 25th, 1981, in which Casey Kasem reads a long-distance dedication letter from a woman who dedicates Thompson's 1979 hit single with the band Night, titled If You Remember Me, to her son who she gave up for adoption and hoped to find someday. Because of that letter, the already very emotional song is even more emotional for me. So if I'm ever supposed to cry in a film, I seriously think I'm going to listen to that song. I'm going to listen to that record right before filming. But back to All the Right Moves, while I think the music is a few notches below the best pop and rock music of that era, it's nevertheless decent and cements the movie's early 80s feel. The one song from the movie that I love is The Last Stand by Doug Cahan, an intense synthesizer-heavy hard rocker that greatly enhances the scene in which the players are riding on the school bus to the Walnut Heights game. All the Right Moves is available on DVD, unfortunately with no bonus materials except for 2 versions of the same theatrical trailer. One with English narration and the other with Spanish narration, though the dialogue in both trailers is in English and no subtitles are included in either case. But despite the lack of audio commentary or a documentary, the movie alone makes the DVD a great buy. And getting to a very sensitive topic, I'm glad that Tracy did not have an abortion and that Brian fulfilled his responsibility to her and the baby. At the time this movie was made, there was far less knowledge about the humanity of the unborn child than there is now, and while it's tough to go through a pregnancy while in high school, it's a selfless act of love to tough it out and give birth to a child. And furthermore, as all of my female acquaintances who I know have had an abortion remain severely traumatized by it even decades later in some cases, I always hate to see abortion portrayed as being devoid of emotional consequences. Finally, lightening up a few notches, I'd like to share with you my very odd personal connection to this movie. Before I was an actor, I was a musician, and when I decided to get into film, besides pursuing acting jobs, I tried to get my music into films. I managed to get that accomplished with 2 low-budget comedies in the Philadelphia area that were released in 2006. The feature Downhill, directed by Shane Bissett, and the short All the Wrong Moves, directed by Eric Seidman and Shant Ergenian. Cool Armenian name, by the way. Of course, the title of the latter movie is a reference to All the Right Moves. All the Wrong Moves is about a struggling actor named Stan Sherberry, played by Dan DeVore, who blames his misfortunes on Tom Cruise. Stan goes to a therapist, played by Rebecca Katz, and explains that he's auditioned for several lead roles in major films, but always lost the role to Cruise. In a flashback scene to his audition for All the Right Moves, in a flashback scene to his audition for Risky Business, Stan is lip-syncing to my song, The Rush of Passion's Fire, which is from my only album with the Lec Zorn project, while he dances around in his underpants as Cruise does in Risky Business to the Bob Seger classic Old Time Rock and Roll. But amazingly, 5 more years would pass before I finally saw All the Right Moves. So in conclusion, All the Right Moves is a first-class drama that has a great mix of football with life messages, and if you can endure the R-rated elements, I think you'll like it very much. My only significant criticism is the aforementioned underdeveloped plot elements, though as I said, they're probably the result of the era in which the movie was released. It currently has a 5.9 rating on IMDb, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. Well, this concludes episode 16. Feel free to share this video and to like Super Deep Movie Analysis on Facebook. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I cordially invite you to do so again in the near future for episode 17. And I promise it'll be much less than 427 days from now. Until then, for Super Deep Movie Analysis, this is Lec Zorn. Good night.